Hi, I'm Jennifer Byrne, and our guest tonight is a rare and fabled beast in the writing world, his work embraced equally by readers and critics. He's been winning prizes, honing his craft for more than 35 years, from early short stories and first novel The Cement Garden, through instant classics like Enduring Love, Atonement and Saturday. And now, a new novel, a 70s spy story with twist, called Sweet Tooth. From Ian McEwan, as he was known in his young days, to England's national author. He's become part of our reading life. And Ian McEwan, thank you for joining us.
A real pleasure.
England's national author. When I first started reading that, I thought, oh, they're having a lend. But no, they're saying it and they mean it really flatteringly. Are you entirely comfortable with that compliment?
No, I'm entirely uncomfortable. I think most of my fellow writers wouldn't go along with it, and I don't. It's
weird.
A novelist needs to be light-footed and not carry too much pack burden, and that kind of stuff turns my stomach just a little.
I can understand.
I like people to like my novels, but that'll do.
Let's talk a bit about your new book, Sweet Tooth, which in short it's a beautiful young woman set in the 70s who gets recruited and groomed by British intelligence. And there are a lot of games going on. Describe, if you would, what she's recruited for.
Well, this is the Cold War, and more specifically, this is the cultural Cold War, when intelligence services, particularly the CIA, took it upon themselves to pour money into culture, into the arts. It's rather an extraordinary idea, but the general intent was to persuade, especially left-of-centre intellectuals, to celebrate or to believe in the West as the bearer of openness, free expression, tolerance, plurality against the totalitarian state. MI5 and 6 were putting money into publishing houses and through other front organizations. And we have to say, I mean, the Soviets were pouring money into the Bolshoi ballet and sending it to us. So it was a battle of ideas. Yes, there are moments of comedy in this because these characters don't really understand the creative process, they don't understand the literary world, and it's really the invasion of MI5, or my version of it, into both the literary imagination of one guy. They back the wrong man, basically.
Entirely the wrong man.
You can't control these things. He writes a thoroughly dystopian novel, which they hate. And in fact, the novel he writes is rescued from an abandoned novel of mine.
There's quite a lot of your early work in there.
There's quite a lot of me in there.
You being what, Tom?
Yes, I was at Sussex University, as he was. I hung around the New Review, run by Ian Hamilton, as Tom does. I had very mixed reviews for my first fiction, as indeed he does. I wasn't recruited by MI5, and no beautiful woman ever stepped into my office and offered me a stipend. So there's maybe a little wish fulfillment in all this. One of my first impulses for this book was a little message I found in a notebook to myself written about 5 years ago. In fact, I might even have been down your way when I wrote it. And it said, "A man writes a novel to get a woman out of his life and ends up doing the precise opposite."
Graham Greene said that the childhood is the bank balance of the writer. Was it true for you?
Both my parents left school at 14. My mother went into service as a chambermaid. My dad, in Glasgow, worked as a butcher's boy and a bottle washer in a physics lab in the university before joining the army, really to escape unemployment on the Clyde. So although I didn't grow up in a bookish household, I did grow up in a home where there was this huge respect for education, for the education that they didn't have. And I was the first in my family to stay on at school past 16, and certainly the first to go to university. There weren't books piled up in the walls, and I read a lot as a child, though. We went to the library a lot. And I'd go with my parents, and
Did they read?
neither of my parents had any childhood books. So no one told me, that Black Beauty or Swallows and Amazons were the books to read. So I had to discover my own tradition. Even at school, I don't remember at sort of early school being told which were children's classics. I learned children's classics.
Which became your classic?
Yes, later. I read them in my teens, very quickly, got them out of the way.
Like what?
Well, Swallows and Amazons. I remember reading The Hobbit when I was 14, with mild interest. By then I was reading Graham Greene and Iris Murdoch and feeling very grown up. I was also reading wonderful sort of slightly lower down the scale books like The Caine Mutiny and Nicholas Montserrat, John Masters.
Dreaming of being a writer?
No, just devouring novels. A bit like my heroine Serena, though not as quickly as she did. So I felt very encouraged, even though I don't come from a literary background. In fact, because my home was not full of harpsichord music or Beethoven and Wagner and poetry, when I discovered these things for myself at the age of 16, my teenage revolt was all these delights. And I've written about this in a couple of novels. I know middle-class friends whose children have all these delights, and so they go down market. They want to be, they want to have a dog on a string, a pit bull. They don't want the harpsichord. So I was coming the other way. So there was some pleasures and advantages. I cannot for a moment make the case that I had a culturally deprived childhood. I was sent at the age of 11. We were living in North Africa, in Libya. I was sent to a state boarding grammar school. Mostly consisted of 350 kids, beautiful country house, like a public school. And the kids, a large proportion of them came from broken homes in central London. They were mostly working class kids. And the idea of the education authority was, let's get kids who've passed 11 plus and put them through a public school education, a private education, in other words, and see what happens. And what happens is all the kids went to university and flourished. Yeah. But it was a curiously energetic, charming, confident place where all the T's were glottal, but the kids were reading Greek and Latin. They were taking places in all the best universities. And it was an amazing success, but it was a very narrow kind of, later on selection at the age of 11 became no longer fashionable. And the school eventually closed down. You
wrote a piece years ago, but it's a beautiful piece called Mother Tongue, and you talk about your mother and how she had an uneasy relationship with words. In fact, you say for her, words were like bombs,
Yes.
word bombs that would go off in your face.
Yes, there was always a sense that they were going to disgrace her.
And you said there was part of that in you, which I find so hard to believe.
Yes, there was a bit of that in me. I didn't quite shake off the unease that she'd passed on to me, that I somehow picked up. So even in my early 20s, I was a little distrustful of language. I always felt, as I said in that piece, that if I'd written a sentence, I would stare at it thinking, was it doing what I thought it was doing, or was it...
And where was it going?
Me? Yeah, and so I was very, very careful and cautious. And I think that's one reason why I didn't write a novel for quite a few years into my writing life.
Did you always want to be your own? When did you decide this is what you wanted to be?
Sometime at university. I was very passionate about literature. By the time I was 16, 17, I was completely hooked.
Yeah.
I was one of those writers with a very gifted English teacher at school, a very charismatic man who filled me with the sort of mission that the study of English literature was like a high priesthood. There was nothing more important, better to do. So at the age of 18, I was relatively well read.
What I thought was so interesting, though, was that that unease that you felt, and when you were writing and with words, you said that it was actually directly came out in the hard surface, that the style you became known for, that very precise, almost crystalline, punctilious use of words.
It was built on fear of getting it wrong, that I wanted to be absolutely right about this. So I couldn't flow onto the page. I wanted to bleed on the page like, I imagine Zola did, Stendhal. But I couldn't. Every phrase I wrote, I heard 1,000 voices saying, well, that doesn't look right. Call that a phrase, call that a sentence. I couldn't extirpate that kind of stuff. And so...
It's a hell of a way to acquire a style.
Yeah, it was a very difficult way. So I would take months to write just, a short story. Because I wouldn't quite inhabit the language the way that most people do. I guess I'd crossed some, in the English caste system, I'd crossed some barriers, but I hadn't come fully equipped into this new space. There was this conversation, which is world literature. I admired, so many writers in it. I wanted to join in this conversation, but I didn't feel quite like I was wearing the suit and tie that was necessary.
Do you feel you are over having to prove anything now?
I never felt I'd prove anything. I always sit down and think this is like writing my first book. Each time I start a book, I think, I don't know how to do this, and it will teach me how to do it. And when I'm about 25,000 words in, maybe halfway, maybe a third, maybe halfway, I think, I've now learned this book, and this is the most delightful moment. I know how the characters speak and move. I know the prose that's appropriate to them. Now, all I've got to do is not get run over by a bus, and I can finish it. But when it's back to just a handful of notes, I feel all the old anxiety.
Do you really?
Yeah, I feel...
But you can do it.
Well, I did it last time, but can I do it again? And that's why it's necessary for me to have this gap, almost a possibility, I suppose, of self-reinvention, become a slightly different person and start all over again anew. So it doesn't feel that it has anything to do with proving anything to anyone. It is simply, there is this book I could write. Will I screw it up? And the discovery that I'm not going to screw it up, somewhere, as I say, around about halfway, is delightful. Then I think, I'm the only person in the world who can finish this book.
At what point was it, Ian, that creative artists also were pushed into becoming performing artists? I mean, it's an expectation now.
I think it started with Dickens, where the rot set in. Jane Austen didn't go on reading tours. But somewhere along the way, I mean, when I started writing in the early 70s, only poets read their work. The idea of a novelist reading their work, it was alien, at least to me. I'd never come across that. And the first time I did it was in a small college in Maine, USA.
And what did you read?
I read a short story, I can't remember which one. It was the first time I'd ever given a public reading. I was very conscious that I was so nervous, my mouth was so dry, that every time I pronounced a word, there was this loud click as my tongue unglued itself from some part of my mouth. And all I could hear were these I sounded like a Kalahari bushman talking click language, And I thought, everybody knows that I'm full of fear. And I don't remember the second time I did it, but slowly you just become used to it, habituated, and slowly writers became not only public performers but constant explainers too. You cannot publish a book without having to go out and explain yourself. And even once with a novel of mine called Black Dogs, I wrote a sort of preface in which I thought, I'll explain this book so I won't have to go around talking about it. But I had to go around explaining my explanation. Why did you write this explanation of your books? So we become explainers. And it's odd, I notice it even now, I've done it so many times, but I gave an interview about Sweet Tooth just 3 weeks ago, and it was the first time I'd spoken about it. And because I lived inside it, it seemed very odd, almost a betrayal. And I fumbled, and then slowly I sort of
remembered,
pick up a kind of patter about it. And then it's interesting and fun. And then it dies. When you've explained it too many times. In 9 months' time, I will have really killed this novel for myself, because I will have explained it, said the same thing, told the same little stories, slightly falsified how did you begin this novel? No one knows how they begin a novel. There's no beginning. You drift into it, half asleep.
By the end of the 9 months when you've been flogging a new book, do you just start making things up? Just actually start telling lies to amuse yourself?
No, what I start saying is, no, I can't do any more interviews. That's what I say. And, for any given interviewer, and some of these are very nice. I promised a certain very well-read, highly intelligent Danish literary intellectual, and or someone from Norway or Poland. They can't sort of see, from my point of view, why I just shouldn't give that hour, which I'd promised. But it's a creeping sense of bad faith. And I've spoken to many writer friends who will feel this. There is a use in this, though. You can talk a book out of yourself. Yeah. And it's very useful. Suddenly, you're free of it. And you can shift your ground. You're no longer haunted by it. You're not going to repeat it. You're not going to linger after it emotionally. It's gone. It's fine. Time to move on.
Really?
Fresh page.
And do you start on the next book during that 9 months or whatever while you're out talking about the last?
I mean, right now I'm in one of these gaps. I like these gaps. I don't feel I have to be writing all the time. I think I personally need a year or 9 months between finishing one thing, starting another. I'm not like Trollope, who just drew a line didn't even turn the page and started another novel right underneath the one he just finished. Time for reading and a bit of travelling and reflection and talking about the last book, fine. And then sooner or later I will get restless and it will start again.
Like an itch?
Yeah. Something nicer than an itch, though. A kind of pleasant yearning feeling to be back.
What do you need, apart from talent? What do you need to be a writer? What does it take?
Well, the privilege of solitude, I'd say, is the big thing, even if it's only 3 or 4 hours a day. I mean, writing is cheap. I mean, making movies costs millions. Putting on ballets and operas also. But a block of A4 paper and a 99 pence pen is all you need. But that time, that release into your own mental space and privacy is the crucial element. I mean, apart from, as you say, disposition, talent, work ethic, all the rest of it, self-discipline. But, and that's why when people ask me, say, about creative writing courses, I mean, I don't think...
Well, you did one.
Yeah, it wasn't a course. I mean, I was the only student, and Malcolm Bradbury only bumped into me in corridors, But there is something to be said for a course, though, because it does give people that enclosed time and space. You might not be able to teach people anything if they don't have the talent. But because they have a little burden of expectation placed upon them, or they've paid money, or they've taken a lot of trouble to, organise the care of children or time off work to do this thing, that's the important element, I think, of signing up to a writing course.
There does seem these days, particularly in America anyway, that you're almost not permitted in the guild. You're not allowed to write a book unless you've been to a creative writing course.
Yeah, I think there's a little too much of it. I think I worry sometimes about American writing, not at its very top level, which I still admire enormously, but in the sort of slightly lower ranks of it. Too many writers are down corridors in English departments on campuses when they should be in cities or in the remote countryside. That generation that's now dead or dying, that included Bellow and Mailer and Updike, and they did not basically live on university campuses. They weren't associate professors and they didn't have MFAs. I mean, they did their share of university work, I know. But we need writers in cities. We want them in bars and pubs, and we want them sort of rubbing up against life a bit.
In 2007, you were quoted as saying, "I still haven't written the book I want to write." So that's some years ago. Have you? Is the new one always the one? Or will you?
No, I still have in mind this perfect thing, to borrow that lovely Jamesian phrase. And maybe I'll, die with that perfect thing still just beyond my fingertips. Maybe it's a necessary thing to have, necessary yearning feeling that, and maybe the form of the novel can't allow this anyway. Maybe the novel is too baggy and capacious to allow itself to be perfect. I can imagine the perfect poem, the perfect novel. Maybe there's a perfect novella.
Maybe you just made it up so that you wouldn't ever write it.
Maybe Thomas Mann's Death in Venice is the perfect novella. I mean, some of the perfect bits of fiction, I think, are novellas. Joyce's The Dead, I think, comes as close to perfection in fiction as you'll find. I think Kafka's Metamorphosis is. Other people say I disagree, but Conrad's Heart of Darkness, I always think that's a bit of a betrayal of his own intention. But possibly it's in an 80-page novella that only there that you'll find perfection. If you stretch yourself to 326 pages, it gets too much like life. You can't control it.
It can't be perfect. Well, in that case, does that leave Chesil? It's Chesil Beach. On Chesil Beach, you're closest to perfect.
Possibly, yeah. Yeah. There is a structural inequality on Chesil Beach, which I was happy with, but I know it sits there like a sort of, like one of those sort of Picasso faces, that, like Weeping Woman, with the eye is on the same side as the ear. That is that a whole life has to pass in 6 or 7 pages at the end before I can get to him being a man in his mid-60s, reliving that moment on the beach. That was always my intention. But I think, is it a little bit of grit that makes it not perfect? I mean, that's possible.
So you still haven't written that perfect novel?
No, not yet.
Do you think you will?
Well, it's a race against time, because as you get older, especially, novelists in their 60s, I think, are an interesting bunch. They're suffering or enjoying, depends how you want to see it, slow neural depopulation, let's call it. There's no question you become less thought-rich as you get older. I watched Philip Roth's 60s with great interest because I thought they were heroic and brilliant and a beacon. It's possible that that perfect thing will come my way, but it's perfectly possible that it will recede from me. It'll get further from me because I won't be as thought-rich as I was in my late 30s. I think somewhere in there, my mother once said to me, and it caused me immense amusement at the time, and actually I've slipped this into Sweet Tooth. She said to me, through a sigh, she said, "I'd give anything to be 45 again." And I was, 30-something when I said, I burst out laughing. I said, "Well, why didn't you say 21, or 17? She said, no, 45 is just the peak of life. Now I know what she meant.
Well, you said once that you had a recurring dream, which is that you were sitting at your desk,
Yeah.
and you open the drawer, and in there is a manuscript. And it's not just any manuscript, it's a brilliant manuscript,
Yeah.
and you'd forgotten you'd written it, and there it was waiting for you.
Yeah, it's the Aspen Papers. Yes, there it is. Actually, since I told the world about that dream, I've stopped having it, which was a great mistake.
It's gone.
It's gone. I've blown it. I've turned it into the actual. But it was a dream I had. I must have had it 6 or 7 times over a great stretch of my adult life. And in dream logic, you see it's there, and it, of course, it's that sort of, oh yes, I do remember I wrote that. Actually, now I say that, I think I did have one recently, slightly different, that there were several novels that I'd written. And I'd forgotten them, and there they all were.
All brilliant?
No, needing work, but really promising.
Well, Ian McEwan, I do hope that your dreams continue and that you enjoy this period where you have given us your latest and before you have to start your next. And thank you so much for talking with us.
It was fun. I enjoyed it.
And that is our program for tonight. Please join me next week when we will be bringing you a fascinating interview with the Queen of Crime, P.D. James. And until then, very happy reading. Good night.